ETB creatures, beloved by Commander players, but who was the first ETB creature? Find out next on Commander Replay. Creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, or ETB creatures for short. A staple of the Commander format, they show up in the vast majority of Commander decks, sometimes in small quantities, or sometimes the whole deck may revolve around them. Either way, they do a lot of good things for you when you play a game of Commander. But this got me wondering, who was the first ETB creature? Well, before we get there, let's take a quick look at a few things about ETB creatures. So I've come up with 3 main benefits of ETB creatures, which is why they are so beloved in Commander. And these all tie together a little bit, the boundary between each one is a little bit gray. First up, they give immediate value. You might think to yourself, do it now! The immediate value that they give makes them invaluable in a game of Commander where you have multiple opponents. The longer a game of Commander goes, the less likely you are to untap with your creatures or be able to get value from them in the time that you need it. Quick example, take a look at a card like Visara the Dreadful. Visara the Dreadful isn't showing up nearly as much as she used to in Commander play, because waiting for her to untap can take a really long time, especially in the later turns of the game. Instead, you might play a card like Noxious Gearhulk or Duplicant, which give you that immediate ability to destroy a creature on the battlefield. Playing ETB creatures are sort of like playing a sorcery and getting a creature all in one. It gives you some kind of needed effect, while also being able to attack and block as needed. Couple quick examples, something like Woodfall Primus and Bramble Crush. Essentially, Woodfall Primus is Bramble Crush on a stick. And same thing with Runescarred Demon, Demonic Tutor. Runescarred Demon essentially being Demonic Tutor on a stick. Both very good creatures that see a lot of Commander play. Benefit number 2, the Creature Body. They give you a creature in addition to the spell half when they come in. Having attackers and blockers is super important in a game of Commander. Just a single chump blocker can deter an entire attack. Look at something like Solemn Simulacrum. How many times do you not attack a player with a Solemn Simulacrum because you won't get the damage through and they get to draw a card? As the game wears on, this can make a big difference of your life total being in Alpha Strike range of another player, or them choosing to attack another player because you're out of Alpha Strike range. And if attacking and blocking is super important, then girl, I'm in love with your body. Benefit number 3, multiple triggers. So yes, with cards like these, here's a few really easy ways that you can abuse those ETB triggers on cards that can go in every single deck. Here's a few more that are specific to each color, and I think it's easy to see how rampant things like Blink, Bounce, and Graveyard Reanimation are in Commander. One quick note, I found it really interesting that the easiest way for you to recur an ETB creature in green is by playing an ETB creature, Eternal Witness. I found that one to be very fitting. It's really easy to abuse the triggers of an ETB creature and trigger them multiple times throughout the course of a game. 2 of the most powerful ETB creatures the format has ever seen were Primeval Titan and Sylvan Primordial. There are some that think these cards should come off the ban list, but I think they've failed to realize it's not the first time these cards trigger that kills you, though it can. It's the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th time that these cards trigger that really start to cause problems. When these 2 cards hit the field, it turns into a game of who can abuse the triggers the most, and it quickly turns into a game of the rich get richer. Ah, those moments where a game of Commander starts to look like the US wealth gap. At least in Commander, the game is probably over on turn 7 when this happens, so you can start a new one, but no such luck with the wealth gap. Also, just consider for one moment that when you cast the Sylvan Primordial, it's essentially like playing 3 Nature's Lores and 3 Bramble Crushes. I know Nature's Lore brings the land in untapped, I was caught between Nature's Lore and Rampant Growth, but you get the idea. And that's just one trigger. For 7 mana, it's like casting 6 spells, plus getting a 6/8 reach creature. Absolutely ridiculous. So with all of that, who was the first ETB creature? Well, in the original set of Magic, we got something really close, with 4 cards out of Alpha. First up is Rock Hydra. Rock Hydra comes into play with X+1/+1 counters on it, and you can pay triple red during your upkeep to add additional counters. Also, I went with the original printing of each of these cards, so the word formatting is really weird on these things. There's Vesuvan Doppelganger and Clone, which both come into play as a copy of a creature. Vesuvan Doppelganger gets the choice to change which creature it's copying during the upkeep, which is fun. And then there's the really terrible Clockwork Beast, which comes into play with 7+1/+0 counters on it, and loses counters based on attacking and blocking. Now, one thing to note with these aren't actual ETB triggers, these are replacement effects, which means that there's no additional trigger that goes on the stack when these enter the battlefield. The Rock Hydra and Clockwork Beast just come into play with the +1/+1 counters, no trigger, and the clones come into play as a copy of the creature, again with no additional trigger. So then who was the first actual ETB creature that came into play and created that additional trigger that we've all come to know and love? Believe it or not, it actually took until the Legends set for Wizards to produce the first ETB creature as we know it today, which would make Stang and Mold Demon the first ETB creatures in the game of Magic. So Stang says, when Stang enters the battlefield, create a token that's a 3/4 copy of Stang with some other text on it. And Mold Demon says, when Mold Demon is brought into play, you must sacrifice 2 swamps or Mold Demon is buried. Ugh. Pretty rough. With Mold Demon, it's a good thing that your vanilla 6/6 makes you sacrifice 2 swamps, otherwise it might be too strong. And then we have one of the weirdest creatures ever printed, but it's actually still very playable in Commander, and I was fortunate enough to pick up a paper copy a long time ago when they were nice and cheap, is Hazazon Tamar. Now this is not a true ETB ability, but it's so weird and is almost like an ETB ability that it's worth talking about. It says, at the beginning of your upkeep, if Hazazon Tamar entered the battlefield, since the beginning of your last upkeep, put a 1/1 red-green-white Sand Warrior creature token onto the battlefield. And then some other conditions about when he leaves play. So it's not technically an enter the battlefield trigger, it's technically an upkeep trigger, but it's an upkeep trigger that's checking to see if it entered the battlefield? Really strange. So not an ETB creature in the sense of the rules, but essentially an ETB creature in the way that it plays out. Really unusual wording. I'm surprised that they haven't come up with more clear wording for Hazazon by this point. But that also got me wondering, how long did it take them to really kind of get ETB creatures on the level that we think of them today? And there were some awesomely bad ones to start with. Here's the usual suspects of cards that are just genuinely awful. 2 of them out of the dark nonetheless. Super flavorful, but yeesh. Not cards that you can really play, like, anywhere. With Wood Elemental probably being one of the worst cards ever printed. So in 1994, they were still trying to get a handle on what ETB creatures should do. Here's a few additional ones that may be a little bit more off the beaten path. I know the 3 previous cards tend to show up on a lot of worst card type of lists, but we've got Electric Eel, which it's not to the level of terrible that the other ones is, but it's just like pointless. Why does a 1-mana 1/1 need to do 1 damage to me when it comes into play and more damage to me when I try to fire breathe it? I don't know. And then there's Phyrexian Marauder, which, man, this card is awful. I know it saw some play in some iteration of the Protean Hulk combo decks, but why? Why would they print a card like this? Let's just run through an example. I pay 5 mana, I get a vanilla 5/5 that can't block and can't attack unless I pay 5 for it? What? Why? Why would they print this card? This was out of Visions nonetheless, which released several years later in 1997, at which point they had a reasonable handle on the power level of cards. Not that they were perfect, I think they were still reprinting Dark Ritual at that point, but generally speaking, they kind of figure out how cards should operate. Why? Why is this creature like that? And just for the epic feel-bads, that is a rare, by the way. Can't wait to open one of those out of a pack of Visions. However, Phyrexian Marauder excluded, the rest of Visions actually had a decent number of ETB creatures on par with what we think of today. So we have cards like Manowar, Necrotal, Goblin Recruiter, and Uktabi Orangutan, with the middle 2 still seeing some Commander play. Manowar and Orangutan I haven't seen recently, but they're still very playable in the right kind of deck. And then with M11, we saw probably the most ridiculous ETB creatures ever printed, which was the Titan cycle, and one of which is now banned for good reason. I would say that Grave Titan and Sun Titan probably see the most play, but Inferno Titan, very respectable. Frost Titan, very respectable, especially for doing like kind of a control thing. What separates these creatures apart is that you get the enter the battlefield trigger, and then you get that trigger again when it attacks, and that is a level of absurdity that we rarely see in Magic. These things are ridiculously good. It is very hard for me to build a black deck without Grave Titan, and it is very hard for me to build a white deck without Sun Titan. These things are just insane. I believe WotC had mentioned that reprinting them in M12 was kind of a mistake because these things were super powerful in Standard, and they really have an interesting effect on the game because at least Grave Titan and Sun Titan are better than basically every 6-drop available in those colors. Mono Black has a lot of really good 6-drops, and I think Grave Titan is just better than all of them. Another thing that I found interesting with ETB creatures is that I think green has the most impactful and best suited for Commander ETB creatures, with staples like Terastodon, Woodfall Primus, Wood Elves, Reclamation Sage, Craterhoof Behemoth, Avenger of Zendikar, those two have never ended a game. These are cards that you would include, not specifically in an ETB deck, just in probably every green deck. It's really easy if you're just building a green good stuff deck that you're going to have tons and tons of ETB creatures in it. Without really even trying, you're just like, well, these are the good creatures, I put them in. They happen to all be ETB creatures. So that was just an interesting point that I found, with green's ETB creatures just being super well suited to things you want to be doing in Commander. And then finally, let's talk about some ETB killers. Here's 3 really easy ways to shut down that mono green ETB deck that we just talked about: Tecatli Honor Guard, Hushwing Gryff, and Torpor Orb. These things will absolutely ruin the party against ETB creatures, and even if you're not specifically trying to hit the mono green deck, every color deck runs at least a few ETB creatures. Other than your like super control decks and your super storm combo kind of stuff, almost everyone's got an ETB creature in there somewhere. You're gonna shut that thing off with these 3 cards. And what's funny about these 3 is that when someone plays them, you'll watch the table misplay into them repeatedly. Like, one turn someone will cast it and they'll forget that they don't get the trigger, and then the next turn they'll do the same thing again. The ETB ability is just so ingrained in us in Commander that when you take it away, they will forget and just misplay into it over and over again. So super painful. If you're the green deck, make sure you're running a Krosan Grip, make sure you're running a Beast Within, something like that. Have some answer to these cards, because you will do nothing if they stay in play and you can't get rid of them. So yes, ETB creatures. They've sort of been around since Alpha, but really truly since Legends, and it did take them a number of years to get the dials tuned in just right. But now, they are a mainstay of the Commander format, and something that I think everyone enjoys. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at ETB creatures and finding out who the first ETB creatures were, which leads us to, what kind of ETB creatures do we think we'll get in the future? One that I would personally like to see is a Reclamation Sage in white. I don't feel like it's breaking the color pie at all, it just seems like there should be one. So I'll keep my fingers crossed that one of those comes out soon. Anyways, I want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and make videos like this possible. If you want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.